Hi folks, this is part 2 of our chapter 1 lecture from the Hubbard text. So we ended off the last one talking about how markets had a tendency to produce efficiency. And that's certainly true, and if there's one thing that you can catch on to right away, it's that economists love efficiency, pretty much above all else. Now in terms of how we talk about efficiency, there's two concepts that I'd like you to grab onto right away. One is productive efficiency. And productive efficiency is more or less being able to produce stuff at the lowest possible cost. It's probably the thing that immediately pops to mind when you think about efficiency. The new concept for you is probably allocative efficiency. And allocative efficiency is basically asking whether or not the amount of stuff you're creating makes sense. So in other words, if you've created an object, was the benefit of that last object you've created equal to the costs of creating that object? And if that's true, then our golden rule applies, MB equals MC. Now, it's entirely possible that you're in a situation where you've created objects that do not have benefits equal to their costs at the margin. And then, of course, this would imply that you were making stuff society didn't value as much as it cost society to make. The reason that economists like markets so much is that we're going to see that markets, when they're perfectly competitive, drive us to create an amount of output that makes sure that we are following this golden rule. So, markets tend to promote efficiency, in essence, because they foster competition and allow people to engage in voluntary exchange. No one has to do anything in a market unless they want to. So both parties of the trade are looking at the trade and saying, yes, I want to do that. It makes me better off. And this is a recipe for efficiency. Now, another thing to think about here is efficiency an altar that we should sacrifice ourselves upon? Because what we're going to find out is markets tend to care about very little aside from this narrow definition of efficiency. So when you start looking at folks that are complaining about markets and their unfairness, oftentimes what they're going to get at is that they would prefer more equitable outcomes, and those might not be efficient. So econ has a tendency to stray always in the direction of the efficient outcome. You're going to find folks that will tell you, I don't really care if it's efficient, I just find it unpalatable. It's not an okay outcome. It violates some sense of values that I have, or they might just describe it as an inequitable outcome. We'll get into that more in later chapters, but I really think that a lot of the arguments in economics sort of fracture along these lines, right? Or I should say, arguments between economists and folks that are critical of markets. Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on efficiency. Let's go ahead and move over to positive versus normative analysis. Econ in recent times, like the last 150 years, has definitely moved in the direction of positive analysis. In fact, they've almost developed an allergy to normative analysis. And really what's behind that is they're trying to emulate the scientific tradition. They want to create testable hypotheses, and what they're interested in is developing facts. So they want to talk about what is. And the other side of this is, well, what ought to be? In other words, what should the world look like? When we start talking about what should the world look like, or how ought people to behave, this is really normative analysis. And so if we want to characterize this simply, you might think about positive analysis as about facts, and you could think about normative analysis essentially as values, value judgments. So oftentimes people will talk about normative analysis as simply opinions. I think that you want to make a distinction here, and let me give you a quick example. If I tell you that I don't like the color red, let's say, it pretty much doesn't imply anything other than my preference for something. If I were to tell you that one shouldn't be cruel to animals, that isn't necessarily a fact. It's clearly a value judgment, but it does definitely imply that your behavior should change because of this, or I would expect you to conform with that value judgment. Now, you may not do that because we may not share the same values, but my point is that when we start talking about should and ought, we're trying to get people to recognize a value, and hopefully it's widely enough shared that, they can get some agreement about how to behave. A good example of this is most people would agree with you should not kill people. In fact, a lot of people would even make the mistake of considering it a positive statement, but it's not a fact. It's just a value that's very widely shared. Probably something to do with the value of human life and that you shouldn't, end it needlessly. Okay, that's clearly a normative statement though, because it is about the value of human life and how, in fact, we would like people to behave. So that's really the difference between positive and normative analysis. When you turn it into specific economic sort of inquiries, you might ask, what's the optimal bundle that I should buy to make me most happy? Microeconomics is going to be very, very good at telling you buy 4 bananas and 2 oranges, given your preferences and a budget constraint. That's positive analysis based on our assumptions. When we start getting into normative stuff, we might start asking who really deserves output within society, and how should we portion out the products of all of our labors. This is clearly straying over into some of those questions about distribution, and is most definitely going to be a normative thing. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a lens to look through those two, but those are definitely two concepts that you'll see in other areas, and you should know them. Okay, so our last major point out of the 6 that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture is about models. Creating them, using them, really it's about what we should expect from them. And one of the things that can be most frustrating to students, particularly with microeconomics, is that we're building a model that is basically rooted in a rational choice framework. We're making an assumption that everyone is going to rationally use the resources around them to produce the best outcomes for them, right? Happiness or profit. A lot of folks immediately start saying, well, I'm not sure I see rationality everywhere around me. That sort of seems like a bad assumption. And so if your model is built on rationality, then maybe I should just ignore it. I think that the way to start attacking this problem with micro and getting a good sense of what's reasonable to expect is understanding the role of abstraction. Okay? Why is it that we're going to come up with these generalities or these assumptions that are not always going to be perfectly true, but we pretty much act like they are? The real issue here is that it's an absolute necessity to do this. We might start building an elaborate theory about me and my preferences, and I like hockey and I prefer to fly fish, and I really like wool clothing and sweaters. I don't like shorts much, and we just get some sense about Chase and what Chase is into. That's not particularly useful when we start thinking about the entire planet. If we're trying to come up with a general theory about how human beings make choices, we really shouldn't focus on the particular concrete things about me. We should start thinking about essentially the least common denominator, or the abstract generalities that describe how human beings probably try to do things. So you'll hear people say, that's fine in theory, but what about in the real world? And this is usually a complaint that the model's getting a little too abstract. And you may have heard people say this before to you after you've explained some new thing you've learned, and they immediately start coming up with counterexamples or ways in which that your model doesn't perfectly describe things. I think that you need to start becoming okay with imperfection. And this leads us into our next point. Models are essentially metaphors. They're stories. they are not intended to be the real world. If in fact the real world was easily accessible, we wouldn't have tried to create theory to explain it. Theories are necessarily imperfect and abstract because they help us get started on telling a story that out there in the real world has a few too many moving parts and is too complicated to actually be understood unless we start paring it down and looking for those, those rules and assumptions that we can help to start building an explanation around. So I want you to think about models essentially as a metaphor, and you could even use a real simple example. A silver dollar is the moon. So you got a metaphor there, and you could think about it in terms of a silver dollar is literally the moon. And of course, that's not the real world, it's not accurate, and you would say that this is a bad model. But if no one had ever seen the moon before, and you told them that it was a silver dollar, and a silver dollar did mean something to them, they might start out with the idea that it's roughly roundish, it's shiny, perhaps it's made of metal. You basically would get started on an explanation. And of course, it's not good enough. You're going to want to add more details to it later, and you're going to get into, the fact that the moon's actually roughly a sphere, and it's, not actually silver, it's a bunch of different rock, but the sun shines on it and reflects, and so it looks light colored. You could get into all this detail later, but if you started out with all that complexity and someone really didn't know what the moon was, you'd probably drown them almost at the outset. Your conversation would just be too much. So I want you to get comfortable with the idea that we're going to come up with some assumptions, and they're not going to be perfect. But what we do want to do is start getting some explanatory power out of them, and we want to generate stories and explanations that are useful. And ideally, we're going to be able to take those explanations out, and we're going to be able to test them. Do they help us explain actual behavior that we're seeing out in the world? It's not going to do it perfectly all the time, but if it gets us going in the right direction, we can always add more detail to it later. Okay, so essentially, I want you to think about a model as being abstract, and that's a good thing because it makes the real world something you can deal with. And that abstraction allows you to start telling stories and hopefully start making predictions about what's going to happen. Now, if it fails, then we need to examine our assumptions and revise. So there you go. There's a little primer on models. And one thing that I would caution you, and this sort of ties back into our first complaint that we talked about up here, models are not reality. Do not make the mistake of assuming that the model is reality. Theorists who continually say, but the model says, even in the face of the real world behaving differently, they've got a problem, right? So you're always going to expect to be testing and refining these things over time.